The golden age of guilds. The cartel of stitches. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a knitter. What comes to mind? If you are like 99% of the modern population, you are currently visualizing a scene of ultimate, unthreatening domestic tranquility. You are picturing a plush, oversized armchair. You are picturing a steaming mug of chamomile tea resting on a doily. And you are picturing a gentle, silver-haired grandmother, peering sweetly over the rim of her reading glasses as she peacefully loops soft, pastel-colored yarn into a slightly lopsided sweater for a newborn grandchild. It is an image that is safe, cozy, and culturally ubiquitous. It is also entirely, historically, and spectacularly inaccurate. To discover the true historical crucible of professional knitting, we must travel back in time. We are leaving the cozy modern living room and stepping onto the freezing, dung-covered cobblestone streets of 16th century Europe. Here, the craft of knitting was neither a relaxing pastime nor a gentle domestic art. It was a vicious, fiercely protective, completely male-dominated labor cartel. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, knitting was a high-stakes, highly secretive, big-money industry run by burly, obsessive men who guarded their trade secrets with the kind of paranoia normally reserved for modern state intelligence agencies. To understand how knitting became the exclusive domain of aggressive male syndicates, we first have to ask a rather bizarre question. Why did anyone suddenly care about knitting in the first place? For centuries, human beings had been perfectly content wearing woven cloth. They spun wool, they wove it on large wooden looms, and they cut it into tunics and cloaks. Woven cloth is durable, it is warm, and it is relatively fast to produce. So what changed? The answer boils down to a single, incredibly powerful force: the vanity of the Renaissance man. Let us talk about calves. Not baby cows, human calves. In the 14th and 15th centuries, European men's fashion underwent a radical, highly revealing transformation. The long, flowing tunics of the early Middle Ages began to creep steadily upward. Hemlines rose to the knee, then to the mid-thigh, and eventually the tunic became little more than a short jacket that barely covered the hips. Suddenly, the entire male leg was on display for the world to see. To show off a well-turned calf and a muscular thigh, a gentleman required tight, elastic, perfectly form-fitting legwear. Have you ever tried to stretch a woven piece of linen over a muscular human calf? It does not work. Woven fabric has very little natural give. If you cut it straight, it bags at the knees and sags at the ankles. If you cut it on the bias, it might stretch a little, but it still looks like a deflated accordion. The men of the Renaissance courts were not going to tolerate sagging ankles. They wanted their legs to look like sculpted marble pillars. Enter the knitted stocking. Unlike woven fabric, which relies on a rigid grid of intersecting threads, knitted fabric is composed of a continuous, interlocking series of loops. This looping structure gives the fabric a miraculous, almost magical elasticity. A knitted stocking can stretch to accommodate a bulging calf muscle and instantly snap back to perfectly grip a narrow ankle. Almost overnight, the knitted stocking became the absolute pinnacle of aristocratic fashion. Kings, dukes, and wealthy courtiers demanded incredibly fine stockings, usually knitted from impossibly thin silk threads, and sometimes even woven with strands of genuine silver and gold. Because these items were incredibly difficult to produce, and because they required raw materials that were extremely expensive to process, the men who knew how to make them quickly realized they were sitting on an economic goldmine. To protect this goldmine, they did what any group of men sitting on a lucrative secret does. They organized. Knitting guilds began to appear in France by the 13th century, with the earliest known organized group documented in Paris around the year 1268. By the year 1514, the Parisian knitters were recognized as one of the 6 corps, CKOR, the 6 most powerful, influential, and politically connected trade guilds in the entire city. This was not a quaint craft club. Being one of the 6 corps meant you had the power to dictate international trade statutes, fix market prices, buy off local politicians, and ruthlessly crush any uncertified competition. By the late 16th century, The guild system had spread like a highly profitable virus across Western and Central Europe, firmly establishing chapters in Germany, the Netherlands, and Spain. In Germany, the first evidence of commercial knitting emerged in Nuremberg, where an exclusive guild of trouser and stocking knitters was officially certified in 1590. The men who ran these guilds were wealthy, they were influential, and they were utterly merciless when it came to defending their market share. They had transformed the humble loop of yarn into an empire, and they intended to keep the profits firmly locked within their heavily guarded brotherhoods. The 6-year grind. Now you might be thinking to yourself, this sounds like a great racket. How do I get in? How does a young man in 16th century Europe join the illustrious ranks of the knitting cartel? It was not simply a matter of paying an entry fee and signing a ledger. Joining one of these elite guilds required a physical and psychological endurance test that consumed the better part of a young man's youth. The path to becoming a master knitter was a grueling, multi-year gauntlet specifically designed to weed out the weak, the impatient, and the clumsy. The journey began with a formal apprenticeship. If you were a teenage boy lucky enough to be accepted, you were essentially signing away your freedom. You moved into the home of a master knitter and became a heavily exploited, highly specialized servant. For 3 agonizing years, you were the absolute bottom of the workshop food chain. You did not start by knitting glorious silk stockings. You started by sweeping the floors, emptying the chamber pots, and washing the raw, lanolin-soaked wool. Raw wool, straight off the sheep, is incredibly greasy and smells aggressively like a damp barnyard. The apprentice would spend countless hours hauling buckets of boiling water, scrubbing the fleece, and picking out the burrs, twigs, and dried feces. Eventually, if he proved he possessed a decent work ethic and hands that did not constantly drop things, he might be allowed to pick up a set of needles. He would be assigned the most monotonous, mind-numbing drudgery of basic production, churning out coarse woolen caps day after day. The true secrets of the trade, the complex mathematical shaping of a heel, the intricacies of color work, the handling of delicate imported silk, were kept strictly out of reach. If the apprentice managed to survive these 3 years of domestic servitude without succumbing to dysentery, the bubonic plague, or the sheer boredom of knitting thousands upon thousands of basic stitches, he was promoted. He achieved the rank of journeyman. The word itself comes from the French word journée, journée, meaning a day, because these young men were finally permitted to be paid a daily wage for their labor. But the journeyman was not allowed to simply stay in his hometown, rent a storefront, and start selling socks. The guild explicitly forbade it. Instead, he was thrust out the door and into the Wanderjahr, VONDerjahr. The Wanderjahr, or wandering year, was a mandatory period of travel that actually lasted anywhere from 3 to 4 full years. The journeyman knitter was required to pack a small bag, pick up a walking staff, and leave his city. He traveled entirely on foot across the muddy, bandit-infested roads of Europe. He moved from town to town, from country to country, seeking temporary employment in foreign guild workshops. Why force a young man to walk from Germany to Spain just to knit? It was, essentially, a massive, continent-wide exchange program of textile intelligence. By forcing their young knitters to travel, the guilds ensured that the highest standards of the craft were circulated. The wandering journeyman would arrive in a new city, knock on the door of the local guild hall, and offer his labor. In exchange, he learned their regional secrets. He learned new geometric patterns from the Netherlands. He learned advanced dyeing techniques from Italy. He learned the structural complexities of the Spanish pearl stitch. It was a brilliant system for preserving the artistry of the trade, but it was an incredibly difficult life. The journeyman relied on the kindness of strangers, often hitchhiking on merchant carts, trading a day's labor for a hot meal, and sleeping in drafty barns or crowded wayside taverns. It was a rugged, dangerous existence, but it hardened them. It turned boys who knew how to make simple hats into hardened, highly skilled men who understood the global economy of textiles. Finally, after a total of 6 long years, 3 years of floor-sweeping apprenticeship and 3 years of exhausting, continent-spanning travel, the journeyman was permitted to return home. He was road-weary, his hands were calloused, and his brain was packed with the accumulated knitting knowledge of a dozen foreign cities. He was finally ready for the ultimate trial. He was ready for the masterpiece. The 13-week panic. To gain full, permanent admission into the guild, and to earn the highly coveted right to open his own workshop and take on his own apprentices, the candidate had to pass an examination. But this was not a written test. It was an intense, highly regulated, strictly timed crucible of physical labor known as the masterpiece exam. Depending on the specific regional guild, this exam could last exactly 13 weeks. 13 weeks to prove a lifetime of skill. The requirements were staggering in their complexity. Let us look at the Hand Knitters Guild of Strasbourg, Strahzburg, located in the Alsace region near the modern border of France and Germany. If a young man walked into the Strasbourg Guild Hall and declared he was ready to become a master, the senior guild members would hand him a list of required garments. He had exactly 91 days to produce a meticulously felted cap, a perfectly tailored woolen shirt or waistcoat, a pair of intricate gloves with individual fingers, and the absolute, undisputed terror of the exam, a massive, patterned knitted carpet. I want to pause here, because the modern brain struggles to comprehend that last item. A knitted carpet. Why on earth would a grown man attempt to knit an entire floor covering with 2 needles? Because it was the ultimate, undeniable proof of absolute mastery. These were not small, simple throw rugs that you might place in front of a bathroom sink. According to historical statutes, a guild-certified knitted carpet could measure up to 9 feet long and incorporate as many as 20 different colors of wool. There is a surviving masterpiece carpet, currently held in the collections of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It was created in France in the year 1781, slightly later than the Renaissance, but it perfectly exemplifies the ridiculous standards of the guild tradition. This carpet measures over 6 feet tall and nearly 6 feet wide. It is not a simple geometric pattern. It depicts incredibly complex, sprawling biblical scenes. The central panel features a highly detailed rendering of Jacob's dream from the Old Testament. Beneath that, Adam and Eve stand amidst a lush garden of blooming flowers. Every single petal, every leaf, every face is constructed entirely of tiny, interconnected loops of colored wool. The carpet even features a flowing, beautifully rendered German inscription declaring, "God will continue to send help in despite of mine enemies." Consider the sheer physical reality of producing this inventory under a ticking clock. The candidate had exactly 13 weeks, 91 days. In that time, he had to source the wool, spin it into yarn, dye it perfectly, and knit a shirt, a hat, a pair of complex gloves, and a sprawling, multicolored mural. The mental pressure must have been absolutely suffocating. Picture the scene in week 12. The candidate is operating on minimal sleep, hunched over a heavy, suffocating mass of wool in a small, dimly lit room. His fingers are bleeding, his back is screaming, and the deadline is looming like an executioner's axe. He is working on the face of Adam, in the center of the carpet. He is manipulating 5 different strands of colored yarn simultaneously. Dropping a single stitch, or twisting a cable in the wrong direction, could ruin the entire image. When the 13 weeks were up, the candidate presented his pile of knitted goods to the senior guild masters. Like the most intimidating panel of judges on a modern reality television show, these elderly, wealthy, highly critical men would pick the items apart. They would scrutinize the tension of the stitches. They would check the elasticity of the gloves. They would debate the artistry and good taste of the carpet. If they found the work lacking, if a seam was crooked, or the colors clashed, or the cap did not felt properly, the candidate was flatly rejected. He failed, the punishment was severe. He was not allowed to simply try again the next month. According to guild regulations, a failed candidate was forced to pack his bags, leave the city, and endure another full year of wandering as a journeyman before he was allowed to return and petition for a second attempt. But if he passed, if the carpet was flawless and the gloves fit perfectly, he was granted the title of master knitter. He gained the right to open his own shop, hire his own apprentices, and sell his wares to the wealthiest aristocrats in Europe. He had survived the crucible. The biomechanical nightmare. History books love to focus on the beautiful artifacts left behind, the stunning carpets, the delicate silk gloves, the golden threads. What history often glosses over is the biological cost of that human labor. The human body is a miraculous machine, but it was never designed to hold fine wire needles and execute the exact same micro-movement 100,000 times in a row. What actually happens to the meat, bone, and sinew of a craftsman subjected to the demands of a 16th-century knitting cartel? Long before modern office workers began complaining of typing-induced wrist pain, medical professionals were documenting the absolute devastation of repetitive strain injuries in artisans. In the year 1713, the Italian physician Bernardino Ramazziani published a groundbreaking, horrifying treatise on occupational diseases. He noted the intense fatigue, the cramping, and the physical breakdown of workers who performed relentless, repetitive tasks, describing it as a literal destruction of the body's mechanics. Medical history eventually labeled these afflictions with the umbrella term craft palsy, a broad description for the agonizing muscular rebellion that occurs when the human machine is pushed far past its biological limits. For the medieval and Renaissance knitter, the biological devastation began, naturally, in the hands. Knitting requires rapid, repetitive movements of the wrists and fingers, combined with a sustained, forceful grip to maintain tension on the yarn. Inside the human wrist, there is a narrow, crowded passageway called the carpal tunnel. This tunnel houses the median nerve and the 9 tendons that bend your fingers. When a knitter executes the exact same looping motion for 10 or 12 hours a day, those tendons become severely inflamed. They swell up like angry sausages inside the tight tunnel, crushing the median nerve. The result is a sharp, pulsing pain, followed by a terrifying numbness and tingling that radiates from the wrist all the way up into the forearm. Furthermore, the constant, violent friction of the tendons gliding back and forth causes the protective sheaths surrounding them to literally run dry of their natural lubricating synovial fluid. Without this vital biological lubricant, the tendons chafe violently against the surrounding tissue. This creates a condition known as tenosynovitis, tenosynoviitis, specifically de Quervain's tenosynovitis, de Quervain's, when it strikes the thumb. Imagine every single tiny movement of your thumb feeling as though the tendon is grinding heavily over broken glass. That was the daily reality of the journeyman knitter. But the destruction of the hands was only the beginning. The biomechanics of the work systematically dismantled the spine. A master knitter working on a heavy, complex garment like a winter coat or a massive exhibition carpet would spend hours completely immobilized in a static, hunched posture. The heavy, dead weight of the wool resting in the lap pulled the shoulders sharply forward. This posture compressed the chest cavity, restricting breathing, and put constant, agonizing strain on the cervical vertebrae of the neck and the lumbar region of the lower back. Perhaps the most tragic and inescapable bodily toll, however, was exacted upon the eyes. Today, if a knitter is working on a complex pattern, they sit under bright, focused, high-wattage LED lamps. The Renaissance craftsmen did not have this luxury. They were working with incredibly fine silk threads, often dyed in dark, unforgiving colors like navy blue, deep crimson, or black. They were using knitting needles that were little more than pieces of highly polished wire. And they were doing this microscopic work by the dim, flickering light of a greasy tallow candle, or seated next to a small, murky, leaded glass window during a cloudy European winter. The optic nerves were subjected to massive, prolonged, unrelenting strain. Staring intensely at microscopic loops of dark silk for hours on end causes the ciliary muscles in the eyes, the tiny muscles that control focus, to spasm and lock. The visual degradation was inevitable. Blurry vision gave way to blinding, nausea-inducing ocular migraines. And because the artisan had to look so incredibly closely at the microscopic stitches just to see what he was doing, his head was drawn further and further down toward his chest, which only exacerbated the spinal strain in a vicious, self-feeding cycle of physical deterioration. And how did they treat these horrific occupational injuries? We must remember that this is the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Modern anti-inflammatory drugs did not exist. Physical therapy did not exist. Instead, the exhausted knitter was subjected to the bizarre, frequently terrifying realm of historical medicine. Medieval medicine was based heavily on the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the belief that pain was either a biological imbalance or a direct punishment from God. If a knitter went to the local wise woman or apothecary complaining of shooting pains in his wrist or agonizing eye strain, the remedies were wildly inventive. Surviving medical manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries detail treatments that sound more like witchcraft than science. One highly recommended treatment for joint pain and gout involved taking a live puppy, stuffing it full of snails and sage leaves, roasting the entire animal over a fire, and then using the rendered fat to make a soothing topical salve. If the knitter was suffering from cataracts or severe eye strain, the physician might recommend taking an owl, salting it, baking it until it was completely desiccated, grinding it into a fine powder, mixing it with boar's grease, and rubbing the resulting paste directly onto the sufferer's body. If you didn't have an owl handy, you could always try mixing the gall bladder of a hare with raw honey and applying it directly into the eye with a feather for 3 consecutive nights. It is safe to assume that most knitters preferred to simply suffer in silence. The elite, silver-threaded stockings worn by the kings of Europe were, quite literally, paid for with the crushed median nerves, the warped spines, and the failing eyesight of the men who made them. The knitting police. Because the physical toll of the craft was so astronomically high, and the 6-year apprenticeship so grueling, the master knitters who finally achieved their status were absolutely determined to protect their profits at all costs. They did not believe in the free market. They believed in total, unapologetic economic protectionism, and they enforced it with roaming squads of guild inspectors. In France, these enforcers were known as syndics syndics or jurés jouareys. You can think of them as the knitting police. Their job was to aggressively patrol the city marketplaces, ensuring that no unauthorized, non-union craftsman was illegally selling knitted goods, and that every single item produced by the guild met their absurdly high standards of quality. They were not mere critics, they possessed sweeping legal authority. They could seize private property, issue massive financial fines, and utterly destroy a rival's livelihood. Picture a bustling, chaotic outdoor market in 16th century Paris. A vendor is attempting to sell a batch of knitted wool gloves. Suddenly, the syndics, syndics of the local bonnetiers, Bonnet Yay Guild arrive. The bonnetiers were the specific Parisian guild dedicated to the manufacturing of caps, gloves, and stockings. They do not merely glance at the gloves, they subject them to a hostile, forensic examination. They pull violently at the seams, they count the stitches per inch. They stretch the wool to test its elasticity. If they find that the gloves were made by an uncertified worker, or if the knitter used an inferior grade of wool, or even if the dye job was slightly uneven, the punishment is swift and highly theatrical. The defective gloves are immediately confiscated, but the guild does not simply throw them away or donate them to the poor. To send a clear, intimidating message to the public, and to strike fear into the hearts of rival craftsmen, the inspectors would gather the inferior knitwear in the dead center of the market square and set it on fire. The burning of socks and gloves was a public spectacle. It was a stark, aggressive warning that the cartel's monopoly on quality was absolute and non-negotiable. If you wanted to wear knitted garments in Paris, you bought them from the guild or you watched them burn. This aggressive protectionism was not limited to France. In England, the government itself stepped in to enforce the consumption of knitted goods, creating laws that sound almost comedic to the modern ear. In 1571, the English Parliament passed a piece of legislation known as the Cappers Act. The domestic wool industry was slumping, and the government wanted to artificially stimulate demand. The Cappers Act legally mandated that every single person in England over the age of 6, with the exception of the high nobility, was required to wear a domestically produced, knitted woolen cap on Sundays and holy days. If you were caught in public on a Sunday without your government-mandated knitted hat, you were hit with a hefty fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence, which was a devastating sum for a commoner. There are surviving diary entries from the era detailing the sheer frustration of this law. One entry from 1582 describes an incredibly stubborn woman who absolutely refused to wear the mandated hat, preferring to walk bareheaded in public, intentionally forcing her husband to repeatedly pay the severe financial penalty just to spite him. The Guild's paranoia extended beyond rival human knitters. Their greatest fear was the machine. Towards the end of the 16th century, an English clergyman named William Ley invented a mechanical knitting frame. It was a brilliant, complex contraption of hooks and levers, capable of producing stockings much faster than even the most skilled human hands. Lee brought his machine to Queen Elizabeth I, hoping she would grant him a lucrative royal patent. The Queen took one look at the machine and flatly refused. She did not see a marvel of engineering. She saw an economic apocalypse. She explicitly told Lee that she feared his machine would mass-produce stockings so efficiently that it would put the vast army of hand knitters across her kingdom out of work, plunging them into beggary and triggering a massive economic revolt. The guilds and their political allies fought relentlessly against the machines for centuries. Even well into the industrial era, the hand-knitting cartels viewed mechanization as an existential threat, dragging out a bitter, violent battle between the elite handcrafters and the encroaching shadow of the factory floor. The peasant hustle, needles in the dark, while the men of the urban guilds were knitting silver-threaded silk stockings for royalty, passing 13-week masterpiece exams, and burning inferior gloves in the town squares, a vastly different reality existed beyond the city walls. This was the world of the cottage industry. This was the desperate, unglamorous, freezing realm of the rural peasant hustle. For the farming families of Europe, knitting was not an elite art form pursued for prestige. It was a brutal, daily necessity for physical survival. While the guild masters closely guarded their urban monopolies, the rural poor utilized the craft to stave off hypothermia and generate a few vital pennies of supplemental income during the long, dead months of winter. The contrast in materials was stark. The peasants were not working with delicate, imported Spanish silk. They were working with the absolute cheapest, coarsest, greasiest wool available. The fleece was often spun directly off the sheep by the women of the household, completely unwashed and heavily laden with natural lanolin. The resulting yarn produced incredibly dense, itchy, foul-smelling garments that possessed the texture of a wiry scouring pad. But what this coarse wool lacked in elegance, it vastly made up for in survival value. A thick, tightly knitted, lanolin-soaked peasant sweater was practically waterproof. It could repel a torrential coastal downpour and trap body heat during the bitter, freezing winters. The most astonishing aspect of the peasant hustle, however, was not the wool. It was the environment in which the work was done. During the winter months in northern Europe, daylight is a rare and precious commodity. The sun sets in the middle of the afternoon, plunging the rural landscape into icy darkness. The rural poor could not afford the luxury of clean-burning beeswax candles. Beeswax was heavily taxed and exclusively reserved for the wealthy estates, the nobility, and the sprawling cathedrals. Even tallow candles, made from rendered beef or mutton fat, were an expensive indulgence that a peasant family could rarely justify. So, how do you knit complex, interlocking loops of yarn when you cannot see your own hands? You rely on a desperately primitive, almost prehistoric contraption known as a rushlight. The creation and use of a rushlight is a perfect masterclass in extreme, scraping the bottom of the barrel poverty. In the late summer, the women and children of the village would wade into the local swamps and bogs to harvest the long, reedy stalks of the common soft rush plant. They would sit in the grass and meticulously peel away the tough outer green bark of the reed, leaving only a thin, fragile strip of the spongy, white internal pith intact. These delicate strips of pith were hung up in the sun to dry and bleach for several days. Once the pith was completely dried out, it acted as a highly absorbent wick. But a wick needs fuel. The peasants would drag the dried rushes through whatever waste grease the family could scrape together. This usually meant the rancid, salty scummings skimmed from the top of a boiling bacon pot, or the cheap, coarse animal oils left over from butchering. The grease-soaked weed was then clamped at a 45-degree angle in a crude, wrought iron pincer that stood on the floor or the table. Someone would strike a spark and set the greasy tip alight. The resulting illumination was dismal. A rushlight burned with a weak, sputtering, highly erratic flame. It was not a steady glow. It was a desperate flicker. Worse, it burned incredibly fast. A standard rushlight lasted for no more than 20 or 30 minutes before a child had to quickly jump up and adjust the burning reed in the iron clamp, pulling more of it through the pincers to keep it from burning out completely. Furthermore, because it was fueled by cheap, rotting bacon fat and unrefined grease, the rushlight dripped hot oil continuously onto the floor and filled the small, unventilated mud cottage with a thick, acrid, nauseating smoke. It was by this dim, sputtering, foul-smelling light that the rural women and children of Europe executed their knitting. Because their eyes simply could not penetrate the gloom, and the smoke made their eyes water continuously, they developed an intense, highly evolved tactile memory. They learned to knit almost entirely by touch. They read the bumps, the purls, and the tension of the yarn using only the sensitive, calloused nerve endings of their fingertips. It was an agonizing, relentless routine. After a brutal day of agricultural labor in the freezing mud, the family would huddle tightly around the smoking rushlight, their needles clicking furiously in the dark, churning out coarse socks and heavy caps. These garments were piled up and eventually sold to traveling peddlers for mere fractions of a penny, just to afford enough grain to survive the season. The mobile knitters and the stilt shepherds. Because time was money, and survival was constantly on the line, the peasant knitter rarely sat still. In rural communities, idle hands were considered an absolute sin. To be seen simply walking down the street, without your hands actively working a pair of needles, was considered a shameful, lazy waste of productive time. Historical accounts from the Dalarna county in Sweden describe older women who knitted constantly, their needles flashing while they walked miles down dirt roads to find day labor. The urge to be productive was so deeply ingrained in their psyche that if they finished a project while walking, they would literally unravel the finished piece and start knitting it again, just so their hands would not be idle while on the road. To facilitate this kind of extreme mobile productivity, knitters in Iceland, the British Isles, and rural France utilized specialized tools known as knitting belts or knitting sheaths. These belts featured a rigid, perforated leather pad or a carved wooden stick worn tightly at the waist. The knitter would thrust the blunt end of one long, rigid knitting needle deep into the leather pad, anchoring it firmly to their own body. This body anchoring technique changed the entire geometry of the craft. It completely freed up the knitter's right hand. Instead of holding the needle, the body held the needle. The knitter could now execute stitches at terrifying, machine-like speeds, literally throwing the yarn over the stationary needle. More importantly, it allowed them to knit while walking over uneven terrain, while carrying heavy bundles of firewood on their backs, or while chasing down stray livestock. But of all the bizarre, highly physical adaptations of the peasant knitting hustle, none quite match the staggering visual spectacle of the shepherds of the lands, LOND, region in southwestern France. If you visited the Landes region before the mid-19th century, you would not find the lush pine forests that exist there today. You would find a massive, desolate, incredibly harsh expanse of swampy moorland, sandy bogs, and dense, wet scrubland. It was a miserable place to try and walk. To navigate this soggy, treacherous terrain and keep an eye on their wide-ranging flocks of sheep, the local population adopted a radical, almost comical method of transportation. They lived their lives on giant wooden stilts. The shepherds of this region would strap their legs into massive, hand-carved pine or ash stilts that elevated them several feet above the wet brush and the biting insects. Clad in enormous, shaggy sheepskin coats that made them look like towering, bipedal beasts, they would stride across the marshes with incredible agility. Historical observers noted that a shepherd on stilts could easily travel over the marsh at the speed of a trotting horse. They carried a long, sturdy wooden pole called a POW. When a shepherd needed to stop and observe his flock, he didn't climb down. He would plant the long stick into the soft ground behind him, lean back, and form a perfectly stable human tripod. And there, suspended high in the air above the French swamps, completely isolated in the damp fog, looking for all the world like giant, woolly spiders, what did these towering shepherds do? They knitted. Using coarse yarns spun from the very sheep they were watching, the men would pull out their hooked needles and knit thick, heavy woolen socks to protect their own feet from the bitter damp. Depending on the specific side of the local river they lived on, these heavy stilt-knitted socks were known locally as trabucs, trabucs, or ampels, yempells. It is a delightfully absurd historical image, but it perfectly encapsulates the bizarre, deeply ingrained necessity of the craft. A man balancing on a tripod of sticks, shrouded in raw sheepskin, his hands flying in a blur of yarn as he knits his own winter gear out of sheer boredom and survival instinct. The history of knitting during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance is a story of extreme, almost unbelievable contrasts. It is a tale that swings wildly from the opulent guild halls of Paris and Strasbourg, where elite men in velvet doublets guarded their lucrative silk monopolies with the threat of public fire, to the muddy, freezing bogs of rural France, where men knit coarse wool while perched on stilts. Whether it was a desperate mother squinting through the nauseating smoke of a rancid bacon-fat rushlight, or a nervous, exhausted apprentice suffering from crushed median nerves as he frantically finished a sprawling, 90-day carpet exam, the physical reality of the craft was universally demanding. The golden age of guilds was not merely an era of beautiful textiles and cozy domesticity. It was an age defined by ruthless cartels, grueling physical deterioration, and an obsessive, relentless human drive to conquer the simple, humble loop of thread.